Today, we're taking a look at a little-known German fighter from the late 1930s. Equipped with twin engines, and designed by the legendary Kurt Tank himself, and promising to deliver exceptionally high performance, the Focke Wulf 187 should be listed as the textbook definition for a missed opportunity. But to understand why this is such a missed opportunity, we need to go back to the origins of its development in the mid-1930s. During this period, aviation development was in a slightly unusual place. Thanks to the development of stronger and lighter weight alloys, and the more prolific use of wind tunnels in general when it came to aircraft testing, the overall developments being made in airframe design were far outpacing the developments that were being made towards new aircraft engines. In Europe, this led to a pretty fascinating zeitgeist where for about 10 years, from the late 1920s until the late 1930s, many believed in the concept that the bomber would always get through. And for a large chunk of that time period, that statement was pretty much correct. With the rapid emergence of the cantilever monoplane over the biplane, and factoring in the fact that it was easier to make a large monoplane as opposed to a small monoplane, it was no surprise that in the early to mid-1930s, most of the bombers that were being developed were actually able to outpace the fighter and interceptor aircraft that were being designed to chase them. German designers were of course well aware of this, and indeed, at the time, the Dornier Do-17 was busy embarrassing various European countries, England and Italy in particular, as it was running around various air races outstripping single-engine designs left, right and centre. With this in mind, Kurt Tank, who was the lead designer at Focke Wulf, and who would go on later on to design the famous Focke Wulf 190, proposed that the company should initiate a private venture to design a long-range, twin-engined, single-seat fighter. Preliminary design work was completed before the end of the year, and Tank showed off some of the early drafts of this twin-engine aircraft during an aviation exhibit in Berlin in early 1936. Aiming to convince various members of the Reich Air Ministry of the soundness of his concept. Proposing that his design would be equipped with twin Daimler-Benz 600 engines, each producing 960 horsepower, Tank estimated that the new fighter would have a top speed in excess of 560 km an hour. Now this figure, if it were achieved, would significantly one-up the single-engine performance of other aircraft being developed at the time, including the much-caressed Messerschmitt Bf 109. The performance of the design was promising enough that it even made its way across the desk of Adolf Hitler, who apparently was rather taken with the proposal. But members of the technical department of the Reich Ministry of Aviation were not so keen as their Führer, as they considered that the production of this twin-engine fighter would be a total waste of money. They estimated that it would cost twice as much to build as a single-engine fighter, and they very much doubted that the twin-engine fighter would have the legs on things such as the Bf 109 for particularly long, as rapid advancements were being made with the Daimler-Benz engines anyway. Tank was not one to be dissuaded though. He maintained that his design would still have much greater value because of its greater range when compared to single-engine fighters, and this would make it worth its weight in gold as a long-range escort should the Luftwaffe ever find itself at war. And for those of you familiar with the bomber protection and fighter range issues that the Luftwaffe would later face during the Battle of Britain, this might summon forth feelings of irony, as Kurt Tank's predictions were pretty much right on the money. Despite the less than favourable comments it had drawn from most of the decision-making officials at the RLM, Kurt Tank continued to work on the design of his prototype aircraft. Using his connections to Wolfram von Richthofen, who was at the time the chief of the research and development arm of the Reich Air Ministry, Tank managed to convince Richthofen of the benefits of his design, or at the very least its potential on paper, and so he managed to convince the Air Ministry to put through an order for the production of 3 prototypes. It was at this time that the aircraft would receive its official designation, being known as the Focke Wulf 187, and Tank, being fond of giving his designs avian names, dubbed this new one as the Falke, or Falcon. Official work on the project began at some point in mid-1936. Detailed design work was completed by Rudolf Blaser at some point near the end of the year, and the first prototype was built and completed in early 1937. The result was a sleek, aerodynamic, and surprisingly small twin-engine aircraft. The 187 had a number of design features that were intended to accommodate its intended maximum speed and range. Firstly, the fuselage cross-section was reduced down from its original proposal in order to minimize drag, and this resulted in a cockpit so small that there wasn't actually space for all of the important dials, so some were moved to the inboard sides of the engine nacelles. Secondly, the rear of the fuselage followed the same line as the canopy, which produced far less drag than, say, having a bubble canopy, but it did come at the cost of atrocious rear visibility. This was partially overcome by various cutouts in the fuselage directly behind where the pilot was sitting, though. And thirdly, the engine radiators would be retractable to reduce drag at the cost of efficient cooling. Now, this, of course, would be a far more beneficial feature in either northern climates or in the cooler months of the year. Unfortunately, the efforts to improve the aircraft's potential speed and range were mostly offset by a change in the power plant. Focke Wulf had been unable, in the end, to secure the intended DB600, as Daimler-Benz was at full tilt producing them specifically for the Bf109, and various RLM officials were busy guarding them like a pack of fat dragons defending a giant pile of gold. As such, the design team was forced to switch out and use the Junkers Jumo 210 instead. This resulted in a loss of almost 300 horsepower per engine when it was run at emergency power, and an even greater drop of almost 400 horsepower when it was just running at maximum continuous. Despite this disappointing beginning, the 187 prototype would actually perform better than expected. It flew for the first time on April 10, 1937, apparently flown by Kurt Tank himself, and after further testing at the hands of pilot Hans Seyfer, it was found that, even despite the engine change, the Focke Wulf 187 was able to achieve a maximum speed of 525 km an hour. This was a truly excellent result, as at the time, the Bf109B, which also had the same Jumo 210 power plant, could only reach a maximum speed of 460 km an hour. At the same time as this, the Focke Wulf 187 could pretty much outclimb the 109B, and it could significantly outdive it. These favourable test results were then emulated when the second prototype was ready for testing, and the third was in the air by July of 1938. As the testing program became more intense, the Falke was able to achieve an astonishing dive speed of 735 km an hour. It was during one of these dive tests that one of the prototype 187s was almost lost. During the high-speed dive, the aircraft suddenly developed extremely strong tail flutter, which almost resulted in a fatal loss of control. But as the test pilot was wrestling with the controls, he suddenly heard a loud and somewhat distressing bang coming from behind him, but magically, control of the aircraft was suddenly restored. Following investigation after the now very pale-faced pilot managed to land back on terra firma, it was discovered that the balancing weight fitted on the rudder, which was intended to reduce flutter, had in fact amplified the problem, and it was subsequently removed from the other prototypes. The unexpectedly good performance of the 187, especially considering it had the wrong engines installed, ruffled a few feathers. Somewhat hilariously, the Reich Air Ministry attempted to write off the incredible speed of the 187 over the 109 by claiming that it had faulty instruments, and that the test pilots were writing down the wrong results. Further testing with the newly installed equipment, of course, ruled this out, but it did show the political power that Messerschmitt had when it came to decisions that were being made by the Air Ministry. It was this kind of political arguing and lobbying and utter stupidity that would come back to bite the Luftwaffe in the Second World War, when it was discovered that many holes in their air forces could have been filled by aircraft that were rejected in the late 1930s, despite being perfectly good designs in their own right. But not everything went the 187's way, as one of the Air Ministry's predictions did come to pass. Though its performance was proving to be remarkably surprising, the prediction about cost came to be remarkably true as well. The 187 would cost about twice as that of a Bf-109, mainly from having 2 engines rather than 1, and there was also the question of a slightly longer production time, which meant that an order for 500 Focke Wulf 187s, hypothetically, would take potentially 30% longer to build than an order for 500 Bf-109s. Now, Kurt Tank argued that this disadvantage would be offset, and then some, by the far higher survivability expected of the 187. As it was a single-engine aircraft, it was much more likely to make it home after sustaining engine damage, as it could maintain controllable flight under one engine. If a 109 suffered engine damage, on the other hand, it was sort of just a giant glorified glider. But the RLM was, unsurprisingly, not convinced by Tank's arguments, and very soon they would further confirm their bias against the 187. Coinciding with the testing of the 187, the Luftwaffe had decided that there was the need to adopt a 2-seat twin-engine heavy fighter. This would result in the development of the Bf-110, and Kurt Tank had a mind to convert the 187 to this purpose as well. In late 1937, he proposed a 2-seat version of the 187, which would be known as the prototype version 4, and it featured numerous design changes, including redesigned engine nacelles, increased fuel capacity, and the intention of adding 2 cannons in the lower fuselage to complement the already established armament of 4 7.92mm machine guns. The prototype was completed in October 1938, and it flew a few days later. Unfortunately, the V4 would get barely any testing in before it was written off after an engine fire and a subsequent heavy crash. Despite the accident and some slight teething issues with the design, and the clear bias against it, the design showed enough promise for Focke Wulf to receive a contract for the production of 5 pre-production aircraft to be known as the 187A-0. They were delivered and flown by mid-1939, but the Luftwaffe's opinion of this aircraft remained lukewarm at best. They stated that the lack of a rear gunner precluded it from being an appropriate substitute for the Bf-110, and in terms of being a pure fighter, the consensus was simply in favour of the Bf-109. Once again, Kurt Tank argued about the benefits of extended range over the Bf-109, and once again Kurt Tank was mostly ignored. Despite this, the 187 did technically serve in an operational capacity, as 3 of the 5 pre-production models ordered would serve as defense fighters for the factory in Bremen. Despite some pretty dubious claims of aerial victories, which was probably just plain old propaganda, they likely never actually saw combat. But interestingly, during this time, Kurt Tank himself would serve as one of the pilots, and he conducted several patrols flying the 187. Later, 3 of the aircraft were suddenly sent off to Norway to try and convince Allied intelligence that it was entering service up there, which was further substantiated by the production of somewhat misleading photos, but by this time any plan to actually put the 187 in service was well and truly dead. During its stint in Norway, the 187 was flown by several Luftwaffe pilots that had also flown the Bf-110. They reported that the 187 was pretty much superior to the Bf-110 in almost every aspect. It was faster, it had better climb performance, better dive performance, it was more stable at slow speeds, and it had better handling at high speeds. Some did lament the lack of a rear gunner, but others argued that for this to be a truly effective twin-engine fighter, it had to be kept as light as possible. And honestly, if you're in a twin-engine fighter that's designed to be escorting bombers and you have enemy fighters suddenly on your tail, you've sort of failed at your job anyway. Unfortunately, the praise of the 187 was completely ignored by the RLM, and they were brought back to Germany at some point before 1942 and spent about a year essentially as glorified paperweights in the back of the factory. As the fortune of war shifted, it was considered briefly in late 1942 and early 1943 to attempt to convert the Focke Wulf 187 into a night fighter, but this proved to be nearly an impossible challenge owing to the small size of the fuselage and nose specifically when compared to the size of airborne radar at the time. They would, however, eventually go on to serve as flying testbeds for the development of the TA-154, which was ironically developed from the Luftwaffe requirement for a twin-engine heavy fighter, which is exactly what the Focke Wulf 187 was. The only difference was that the TA-154 was to be constructed from wood instead of alloy. With its good performance, excellent range, and moderately good armament, and with nothing but praise from the pilots who flew it, it is hard to understand why the 187 never entered service. However, as with many wartime developments from Germany, politically motivated lobbying and favoritism ultimately grounded the design, and with such prejudice against it from the start, there really wasn't much chance for it to see any serious production orders during the war. Now, from the Allied perspective, this was a very good thing. If the 187 had been in service during the Battle of Britain, it might have presented a considerable challenge. They would have had the range to escort the Luftwaffe bombers deep into British territory, completely bypassing the endurance issues that the 109s became infamous for, and they would have also been faster than any British design that was currently being fielded at the time. But the Allied pilots defending British skies didn't have to worry about the Focke Wulf 187, and instead they spent their time bullying the slower Bf-110s. Meanwhile, the 187 goes off into the history books as one of the big what-if aircraft when it came to the policy of the Luftwaffe in the lead-up to and in the earlier years of the Second World War. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. Hopefully today's audio quality isn't too bad. I had to do about 1,000,001 cuts with today's video because my cough has been pretty bad this week, so please forgive me for that. A quick heads up as well, this video will be going live once I am away from the office for a couple of weeks, heading up north to sort out some stuff with the house, getting ready for the move, so things will be a bit quiet until early October. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. And thank you to everyone who gave me such amazing and kind feedback about the long Douglas video series. I definitely have plans to do other long videos like that in the future. But, as always, thank you all for your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.